Well, this is a really difficult question. It's a question about attractivity of the gospel that was preached by people like Paul or Peter. It's a question about the state of the culture in the first century CE. And it is really relevant where these people lived and which problems they fancied in their daily life. So I would think that one major issue might be that fear of death was one thing that people brought them into Christianity, into the belief. And the other thing I would stress is that once some people formed a group at Ecclesiae in a local, then they attracted other people by behaving like Christians, by showing expressions of their faith in their works, maybe in works of love, but also as when they experienced the Spirit and they had this ecstatic phenomena. I think that was something that people attracted. I think in the beginning it was the biggest problem that Christ believers, or at least the leaders of these Christ groups, asked the members to stop to worship every other deity. So giving up every form of religiosity that you had before, I think that was the most important obstacle of becoming a Christian. The other thing could also have been that in a city, when you lived in a city, not in the landscape, but in a city, the population was very dense, so everybody could see what kind of religiosity, what kind of everyday doings you have. So it must have been difficult if you had neighbors or family members in your house that said that you're kind of an idiot, or that you lost your mind by becoming member of such a unattractive and a group that is really nothing someone would choose by his own will. So I think this density and this daily life was a really important obstacle. Yeah, of course, in an ancient city there was similar groups according to the social composition and how they acted. We call them voluntary associations nowadays. At this time they were called collegia if they were from a Roman descent, or they named themselves after the deities they worshipped and so on. So there were these associations, and most people, I would say, about a third of the male population of a city was a member in one of these groups, so they knew that. But becoming a Christian was not very different than becoming a member in an association. You had to pay something, you attended gatherings, you had a meal, so this was very similar to associations. But on the other hand, there were some peculiar things in these groups. So they had these ecstatic experiences. It was not a fancy group to be in. So you didn't gain any status or honor by being a member in this group in comparison to the other people in the society. So it was, I think, I regard it as a bigger step to become a member in the Christian Ecclesia than becoming a member in a Dionysiac association. Yes, of course there is a continuity because the specific form of belief in afterlife, there was belief in afterlife in Greco-Roman world in other ways, but this specific form and the idea of resurrection was surely something that came from Judaism, and of course the idea that you're not allowed to worship any other deities. You're not allowed to worship any other deities. That's the important point in many forms of ancient Judaism. But there was some idea of monotheism or henotheism, so worshipping only one God, or seeing one God as the most high God in Greco-Roman world. But it's a little more in Christianity and Judaism than that. I would say that reducing the pantheon or the sphere of deities was necessary for every Greco-Roman man or woman, because there were so many. You had to reduce it to some. Normally, you reduce it to those that were family tradition, or they were connected to your occupation, or you had a special relationship by your ethnicity or by any personal experience. So when we look into household compositions where religion was performed on a daily basis, then you see that there is maybe Egyptian gods and Mercury and maybe Artemis, because it was in Ephesus. So, but that's all. So, and these were the most important gods for those people. So reducing was necessary. Reducing to only one, yeah, that's specific. But I think I would combine it with the prohibition to worship any other. So reducing to one, that's possible for Greek or Roman pagans, of course, to say this is the one God, and he's represented in all other gods or whatever philosophical thinking he had. But worshipping only this one and no other one, that's Christianity and Judaism. Although we must say that not every form of Judaism practiced it that way, and not every form of Christianity practices that way. But that was what we find in the text as a prescription. Well, I wouldn't say so that it was really attracting people or women specifically, because there were other forms of participation possibilities in an ancient city. Women could become a member in certain kinds of associations, not in every kind, so maybe not in an occupational kind, but in Dionysiac associations there were women in there, and there were special associations formed just by women, so for Demeter, for the cult of Demeter or so. So it was possible for women to become members. And the same goes for Christianity. I think that we tend a little bit to overestimate the participation of women because of the history that women experienced until now and still have to experience. But I think that even in Pauline communities, he mentions some women, but he mentions much more men. And all his co-workers that were traveling with him, they were men, unfortunately. There are a lot of things specific for Ephesus, of course. It was the city of Artemis, and it was a very important harbor city, and was a center, the center of Asia Minor, of the west coast. And it was a port for many soldiers coming, going to the east to fight the Parthians. So it was a really important city, one of the largest ones in the Mediterranean. For Christianity, it's interesting that we don't know exactly who founded the Christian community at first in Ephesus, because it was not Paul. So when Paul came to Ephesus later in his days, then there were Christians already there. There's one guy mentioned in his letters, and in the book of Acts, Apollos, who apparently played a role also in Ephesus. But also the Johannine communities are connected with Ephesus, at least to the tradition of the later church fathers. So there is a really interesting situation in Ephesus. We don't know who founded the Christian communities. We have a Pauline community there. We have maybe a Johannine community, or at least a lot of Johannine Christians there. And we have in the late after Paul, maybe the school of Paul had a center in Ephesus. So many letters that we nowadays say they weren't written by Paul, by one of his pupils, that were probably written in Ephesus or in the vicinity of the city. So it was really important, and it became more and more important for Christianity in later times, of course. But I think that's a story that a patristic scholar can better tell. Well, I think that we should not overestimate the number of people that were gathered in a community. So it's not about 500 people coming, sitting there together and praising God, but there are 20 to 30, 40 people maybe who think that Paul is their most important teacher, and he has to say them a lot of things, and they read his letters and they collect his letters and they write new ones. And there are others like the community that was important for the author of the book of Revelation, who saw it in a more different way than Paul saw it, and he had a specific idea. So they lived kind of in parallel, not worlds, but in parallel communities. They gathered together, maybe in houses, maybe in barns, maybe in gardens, wherever, maybe in schools. There's one mention of a school where Paul taught in Ephesus, and sometimes they might intermingle on an individual basis, but I think that's I imagine it a little bit like our churches. We have a Catholic, a Protestant church, and maybe we have an Orthodox church, and sometimes we come together for a Kirchentag, and that's it. I think the importance of Paul is founded only on his letters, that we have his letters. So there were a lot of more people who were really important. We can see from the book of Acts and a little bit from Galatians or 1 Corinthians that Paul regarded Barnabas as the very important people, especially for him and his development as a preacher of the gospel. But there was Peter. There were women, of course, but most of the people that spread the gospel in the Mediterranean world, we don't know anything about them. They are lost to our memory because nobody wrote about them, and they apparently didn't write any letters that were preserved. Well, I would say for Paul was thinking, or my idea of Paul is that he thought the world is going to end. Of course, apparently he said that many times. In the beginning he thought it would happen in his lifetime. The end he was thinking maybe after his lifetime, but anyway, it's imminent. That's one thing. And for Paul, I would say that he had the idea that he has to preach the gospel to the pagans, to the Gentiles, that they believe in Jesus Christ. And after a certain number that is reached, a number that he doesn't know, but God knows it, when this number is reached, then the end is coming, and then whole Israel will see that Jesus is the Messiah and will believe in him, and will be God's own people again. So I think this was for Paul a very typical motivation. For the others, it might be that they thought, well, the end is coming, and we have something that we have to tell you so that you don't fall into despair or will be judged, but you gain life. I think that's a good motivation. It should be enough. I think history is in itself interesting. I read novels a lot, and I like to find out who the murderer is, and I like to find out what happened. Although we don't know if it happened really that way, but I'm just a curious guy. I really like that. But of course, this has to have something more just pleasing me. It has to have something for the society, because I'm paid by the society to do that. So yeah, it has something to do, because we can learn from history how people thought at that time. We can learn from historical inquiry into earlier Christianity, how these texts that are so important for our society today, even today, and are so important for many societies all around the world, how these texts were formed, what were the ideas of those people, which social and cultural factors led them by writing these texts the way they were written. So I think to understand these texts more accurately, and we have to dig into the history deeply. So people in the Greco-Roman world, they had very different beliefs about what happens after death. Most of them, of course, we can learn from inscriptions, thought there's nothing after death. So that's it. But there were some others who thought that the soul is going up into heavens and has an existence there. Others thought that the soul goes into the Hades and stays there, and by some wonder maybe you will be relieved from this existence in the shadow and can get up to the gods and have a wonderful feast there forever with the gods. So there are these ideas, sometimes more articulated, sometimes less. And I think they worked for some people apparently very well. But for most people, it was there's nothing after death. And I would say that Christianity had its foremost part of the gospel, that they believed that there was one person who survived death, and that was Jesus Christ. And he showed that there's no end, but there is a resurrection of the dead. And as Paul said, that Jesus is the first one of this kind, and every other who believes in Jesus Christ or believes in God and in Jesus will receive the same fate, that he will be resurrected at the end when Jesus Christ is coming back. There is interesting development in early Christianity that after a time they were not so happy with thinking of the dead sleeping in the ground until the end is coming. So they had also the idea, or developed the idea, or adopted the idea that someone who died goes, a Christian who dies goes immediately into heaven. And so still we see that even in early Christianity, you had to rethink again this to make it work, and to give the people the consolation that they needed when they experienced death of relatives or friends and so on.